All right, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back for week number 4 of PPA 500. Hope everyone's having a really good week. And we are right now at the halfway point for our class, since this is week 4 out of 8. I do want to thank you for Canvas essay number 2, looking at those 3 principles from the ASPA Code of Conduct. I've gone through and read all of those and provided feedback. Again, I think everyone did a really nice job on the essay. There's a lot of variation between essays, which is always good to read. And of course, when you only have 8 principles, you're choosing 3 of the 8. Obviously, there's going to be some repetition with some of the choices. That's just, statistically the way in which it works out. And it seems like the ones that were chosen most often, I saw fully inform and advise used quite a bit. And that doesn't surprise me at all because of the whole problem with the principal-agent relationship. And when we are fully informing and advising overseers, obviously, we're providing the information to make stricter oversight possible. As rational, self-interested actors, as public administrators, sometimes it's almost counterintuitive and may run counter to our immediate self-interest in order to do so. But it is something that's incumbent upon us as public administrators to provide the information to Congress or state legislatures or city councils to allow them the information they need to properly do their function of overseeing the bureaucracy. I also saw, promoting democratic participation was mentioned quite frequently, and that sometimes that can be difficult because as Americans, we don't always choose to participate, and many Americans choose not to participate in their own self-governance, and you really can't force people to participate if they don't want to participate. And so, again, those just a couple that I saw used quite frequently in the essays, but very nice job on the essays. Those have been graded and feedback provided. Now for next week, you don't have a Canvas essay due next week, but what you do have due is the draft advancement to candidacy form. Now, if you are not in the MPA program, obviously it makes no sense to submit a draft form if you're not in the program. So if you're not in the MPA program, all you need to do is just tell me that, just attach a little comment in the submission area. Just say, I'm in the MPH program or whatever program you happen to be in, and then I'll go ahead and award the credit because it doesn't really make sense for you to have to submit a draft advancement form. If you are in the MPA program, they'll remember to turn in your draft advancement to candidacy form. Many of them have been turned in already, but I provide feedback on that. I'll look at the courses you're taking. I'll look at the course sequencing and provide you some feedback in terms of when those courses are offered in the program. And if I think they should be sequenced a little differently, I will provide you with that feedback. In the program, we do have limitations in terms of monetary as well as staffing limitations. So Dr. Butts, as our department chair, puts the schedule together every semester, but he does have some constraints placed upon him in terms of the number of courses that can be offered. So some electives are not offered every semester. Some electives are offered once per year. There are some electives that are not offered that frequently. They're offered once every couple of years. Again, that's either due to monetary limitations or due to staffing constraints. So I can give you some feedback on your electives as well in terms of whether or not I think they'll be offered in the semester that you're planning on taking those courses. But do make sure to list the semester of the year you plan on taking your courses, and then I can provide you with that type of feedback. As you're filling out your draft advancement form, if you are going to need the internship, and you check that internship box, do make sure to get together with Dr. Matthews, who doubles as our grad advisor and internship coordinator, and talk with her a bit about the internship and where you might want to do your internship at, and whether or not we have an articulation agreement between the university and that organization. So it's usually a good practice if you do know you're going to have to do the internship, maybe sometime later this semester, get together with Dr. Matthews and just start to initiate that conversation about where you might be able to do your internship. So a draft advancement candidacy form for everybody in the MPA program is due then for next week. And since we are halfway through our term, since this is week number 4, it means that we are now bumping up against the midterm assessment. And I've told you that I make the midterm assessment available to you at least 2 weeks before the midterm assessment is due. We have our midterm assessment due in this class on the 27th. So I have made the midterm assessment available to you But I thought what would be good tonight, I always like to go through the midterm and cover the scenarios and make sure that everyone is comfortable with what I'm asking you to do on the midterm. So if it's okay with everyone, let's spend a few minutes here at the outset of class going through our midterm assessment. I'll go through the 5 scenarios with you and kind of give you an idea of what I am looking for each one of these scenarios and each one of these questions. Any general questions before we get into this brief discussion of the midterm? Everybody good? Okay. Now, again, this is an assessment, so it's not like your traditional exam. There are no multiple choice questions or true or false or anything like that. This is all application. So there aren't right or wrong answers. Your answer will be evaluated based upon your ability to justify to me that the answer you are providing is one of the more appropriate answers for the scenario. There could be multiple appropriate answers, just like there are multiple appropriate answers to just about any question in the public sector, in the world of public administration. So your job is to justify why your answer is not necessarily the best one, but is the most appropriate one. So we have 5 scenarios and 2 questions related to each scenario. Each scenario gets at a different piece of information that we cover in the first half of the semester together. So let's start with our first scenario here. Our work as public administrators predicated on the protections and limitations contained within the current manifestation of our Constitution. Assume that you are a delegate at the Constitutional Convention or part of Madison's faction advocating for replacing the Articles of Confederation with a new Constitution. So obviously this is our foundations of American government and Constitution discussion. Question 1A, present an argument for abolishing the Articles of Confederation by discussing 3 primary weaknesses with the document. Now, I provided a link to the articles for you on our website. I've also discussed briefly in class a few weeks ago about some of these flaws in the Articles of Confederation. I'm asking that you select 3 of those weaknesses, 3 of those flaws with the article. Be sure to not only identify the weaknesses, but also present a compelling argument for why these weaknesses may be considered fatal flaws in the Articles of Confederation. So 3 problems with the articles and why those problems were sufficient enough to be fatal flaws to require the replacement of the articles with the new Constitution. Then in 1B, present an argument designed to convince your fellow delegates at the Constitutional Convention, many of whom are considered anti-federalists, why they should trust the new Constitution that you and your fellow Federalists are proposing. In presenting your argument, include a discussion of 3 positive aspects of the new Constitution that may appeal to your anti-Federalist colleagues. A hint for you is you can feel free to use Federalist number 39 and some of the things that Madison tells us in Federalist 39 in crafting your answer then to 1B. So 3 positive aspects of the new Constitution to convince the anti-Federalists to support the new Constitution. So that's our American government scenario. Then in scenario 2, you just started a new job with Kelman and Associates, a large advocacy firm ensconced within a historic brownstone on K Street in Washington, D.C. Excited by the prospect of a new job, you leave on your first day to Capitol Hill to meet with members of the Democratic caucus to discuss a proposed piece of legislation designed to designate several hundred acres of Wyoming open space as federally protected territory. You are shocked to learn that you are only one of many lobbyists scheduled to meet with legislators on the same topic today. In addition to you, there are drilling advocates from other advocacy firms, advocates representing the rights of Indigenous people, and many others vying for the attention of the members of Congress. So in question 2A, reflect on your predicament. What does Madison tell us about multiple factions in Federalist 10? Do you think Madison envisioned what you are experiencing? Why or why not? And then in 2B, we kind of shift gears into our coverage of ethics. So in 2B, in the course of your day, you meet with Representative Roger McGreevey, a 10-term representative from Idaho. As you begin to make your pitch for designating the land in question as federally protected open space, Representative McGreevey interrupts you. I have a keen interest in this bill because I own several acres in Wyoming adjacent to the land in question. I am opposed to the legislation. Drilling means jobs and commerce to the area, and my land value will skyrocket if I vote against this bill and allow drilling to commence. After a long day of meetings, you head back to K Street, but can't stop thinking about what Representative McGreevy said. In your opinion, is what McGreevy told you an ethical violation? Should he recuse himself from discussions on the bill and any eventual vote? Why or why not? Would his behavior violate any of the standards in the ASPA Code of Conduct? So that gets us at our accountability and ethics that we began talking about last week, and we'll finish up talking about in the first half of class tonight. Then scenario 3, the city of Preble Heights, fictional, it's not the one in Ohio, it's a fictional one, is a working class neighborhood just outside of Indianapolis, Indiana. The city council has recently embarked upon a debate regarding the rehabilitation of the deteriorating recreation center on the outskirts of town. The recreation center has been closed for 6 months pending some major renovations to ensure the safety of patrons. The council is split. 2 members would like to have the city spearhead the renovations. 2 members would like to turn the renovation project over to a private sector contractor who has a reputation for getting projects done quickly. The city manager presents a study that shows turning over the renovation to a private contractor would mean that the recreation center would be renovated 3 months ahead of schedule and would cost 20% less than if the project was managed by the city. The 5th council member is undecided and needs some guidance. Question 3A, discuss some of the reasons why the private contractor may be able to complete the project quicker and for less money than the city. 3B, discuss some of the disadvantages of turning the project completely over to a private entity. This is your private-public comparison that we're going to talk about in the second half of class tonight. So once we are done with class tonight, you'll have all the information that you need to answer scenarios 1, 2, and 3. Then scenario 4 gets us into a discussion of public administration as a discipline. As discussed in class, there is still some controversy regarding public administration as a discipline, and we will cover this information at the beginning of class next week. Some feel that public administration is a discipline. Others argue that it lacks the requirements of an academic discipline and is actually a subfield of political science. The debate can be seen in the location of MPA programs across the country. Many MPA programs exist within political science departments. Some are housed in a college of business, while others maintain status as standalone departments or colleges. And for the past 12 years, I've been a site visit chair going around to MPA programs around the country for the purposes of helping them through reaccreditation. And I can attest to that. The majority that I see around the country tend to be within political science departments. So they're one program within a bigger department of political science. But I've seen several in the College of Business. I've seen some in College of Health. I've seen some in College of Education, actually, College of Liberal Arts. And then I have seen some like our department, which while we are in a College of Health and Human Services, we are a department. And so we are a standalone department that offers only one program, and that is the MPA program. So there are a lot of different manifestations of MPA programs around the country. Discuss the field of public administration as a discipline. What elements of the study of public administration make it an academic discipline? What elements argue against public administration as a discipline? And again, we'll cover all that information at the very beginning of class next week. Whether a discipline or not, the field of public administration has always struggled with the perception and reality of a politics administration dichotomy. Originally presented by Woodrow Wilson in 1887, the politics administration dichotomy debate has been a central theme in the field of public administration for many decades. Discuss the politics administration dichotomy and its impact on how we study and engage in public administration. We will, in the second half of class tonight, we will begin to touch on the politics administration dichotomy with Woodrow Wilson. I will actually make mention to it as we finish up our discussion of ethics and accountability as well. And then for next week, you have the Wilson article assigned as one of your readings from the classics text, and we will go back and talk about the politics administration dichotomy again next week. So the information to answer 4B, some will come from this week, some will come from next week's session. And then finally, the 5th scenario, the Department of Aging in the state of confusion is in crisis. The governor appointed Perry Lemon as the director of the department 6 months ago. Lemon is an ardent partisan with no experience in issues of aging and no discernible leadership or management skills. Lemon's incompetence has only added to a toxic organization culture where there is little trust between employees and outright warfare between units over scarce resources. It is not uncommon for one unit to sabotage another unit, and there is little indication that units know or care about the mission of the organization. This toxic culture has resulted in several externalities or several consequences, negative consequences. Retention is at an all-time low. Employees are leaving the organization so quickly that human resources cannot replace them with new employees. The onboarding process consists of a 10-minute video explaining the organization's purpose and little else. The organization has become fixated on applying rules and regulations with little regard for serving citizens. It has gotten so bad that the state legislature has lost confidence in the department, which has led to a further reduction in the organization's appropriations. 5A, select 2 classical organization theorists or theories that you feel would benefit the organization. Discuss these theories and why they would benefit the organization. And then in 5B, select 2 neoclassical organization theories or theorists that you feel would benefit the organization and discuss these theories and why they would be beneficial. This is your organization theory question, and this is what we will cover in the second half of class next week. So once we finish class next week, you'll then have the information you need to answer that scenario. So once we're done with everything next week, then you'll have all the information you need to do the midterm assessment. After class tonight, you will certainly have the information you need for scenarios 1, 2, and 3, and also some of the information you need for number 4. Number 5, again, you'll get completely next week. In terms of the length of these answers, I am a big believer, as you probably already know, in being as parsimonious as possible. So be as concise as you can while still providing a complete enough answer. Usually what we're looking at for each one of these questions, usually 2 paragraphs, sometimes 3, 2 to 3 paragraphs is usually going to be more than sufficient to be able to answer the questions. You know, if you've got a question like in 1A, 3 primary weaknesses of the document, maybe a brief paragraph for each one of those weaknesses would certainly make sense, but 2 or 3 paragraphs should be sufficient for each one of those questions. So be as concise and parsimonious as you can be. Again, no right or wrong answers. Your answers will just be evaluated based upon your ability to justify why you believe your answer is appropriate in that given situation. So a midterm is worth 100 points. So you've got 20 points per scenario, 10 points per question, and that's how it will be graded. So any questions on the midterm assessment that is due by midnight on February 27th? Okay. As you work on the midterm, you know, some questions may emerge. If questions emerge as you're working on the midterm, as always, feel free to just shoot me an email, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions you have. There are no right answers, so there's no what's the right answer. So any clarifications you need, I'm happy to answer those for you. Okay, let me go ahead and share out our accountability and ethics slides. Okay, you should be able to see them now. And for our agenda tonight, there we go. What I would like to do is spend the first half of class talking about accountability and ethics. And then once we conclude our discussion of accountability and ethics, we'll be able to take a break tonight, and we'll take about a 10-minute break or so, and then come back in the second half of class. We'll turn our attention to talking about some of the major differences between public and private sector administration to provide a justification for why we get an MPA degree as opposed to an MBA degree, and why we study public administration somewhat differently than the way in which we study private administration. So we'll talk about some of the similarities and some of the differences between the two sectors. If you've had a chance to take a look at the Graham Allison article from your classics text, I believe it's number 36, we'll also talk about that, and I'll kind of frame our discussion of similarities and differences between the different sectors. But first and foremost, let's finish up our discussion of accountability and ethics. I know at the end of class last week, because we didn't have much time left, we just kind of fast forwarded directly to the ASPA Code of Ethics, just to give you what you needed to do Canvas essay number 2. Well, let's kind of backtrack now and do our entire complete discussion of accountability and ethics. So accountability and ethics, it's a very important topic that I think I've mentioned to you before, that our accrediting body requires it to be covered in every accredited MPA program. You can either cover it by having a standalone required course in ethics, or you can sprinkle ethics and accountability throughout your entire core curriculum. We've chosen that latter option. So you're going to encounter ethics and accountability, not just here, but in most of your future classes as well. So I think we're all pretty familiar with what accountability is. Accountability is monitoring the relationship between people and things. So we can hold people accountable for their actions in terms of the way in which they relate with other people. We do that through human resource management. We can hold people accountable for the way in which they manage money. We do that through budgeting and finance. We can hold people accountable for the way in which they're implementing policies and implementing programs. And we do that through policy analysis and through program evaluation. So a lot of the things that you do in the core courses in this program are really very much oriented around accountability, trying to manage that relationship between people and things that they are managing or people they are managing in the public sector. And it really is of utmost importance because it forms that foundation of a bureaucracy. Because what accountability and ethics will do, when you have a code of ethics and ethical standards to hold people accountable to, you are able to have policymakers have mechanisms they can use to control the actions of administrators. Now, throughout tonight, we'll be making reference to Wilson's politics administration dichotomy. And in Wilson's politics administration dichotomy, he kind of draws a line between the political world and the administrative world. So in the political world, you have elected officials, policymakers who make laws. And then in the administrative world, we have administrators, bureaucrats who then implement those laws. The elected officials, the policymakers, need to be able to hold the implementers, the administrators, accountable for how they are implementing these policies and these laws. So it really is the bedrock of what we do in public administration. The problem with accountability and ethics is that holding people accountable often has a very negative association. Because when we think about holding people accountable for their actions, we think about discovering problems. That if we're holding someone accountable for their actions, we may be able to discover things that they have done wrong. We may be able to discover malfeasance or misfeasance in their behavior, things that they have done wrong on purpose, intentionally, things they have done wrong just because they don't know any better or don't have the skills to do them the correct way. But there's always this negative association that once you hold someone accountable, then you're going to find out bad things. You're going to find out negative things. And for elected officials, they oftentimes don't like to learn those negative things, because if they find out that an administrator or an agency is doing something that is not in accordance with the law, then they, as elected officials, may be held accountable for that by the voters as well. So the problem with getting accountability done in the public sector is those who are supposed to be the ones holding others accountable, your policymakers, your elected officials, oftentimes shy away from accountability because they don't want to make these problems blow back on them. And they don't want to look bad by uncovering problems going on in the administration. So there's a hesitancy on the part of some overseers, if you will, some elected officials and policymakers, to engage in enforcement of accountability and ethical standards. Whenever you enforce accountability and ethical standards, especially when you have very high ethical standards, sometimes those high ethical standards could mean that we're not going to operate as efficiently as we otherwise would as an organization, because we have hoops to jump through. We have boxes we need to check off in terms of doing things. So you think about something like contracting. We spend a lot of our time in public agencies entering into contracts with private sector contractors. So we're going to construct a new city hall. Well, we are not going to use our government employees to contract to build that city hall. The actual construction, we're going to contract out with a private contractor. That means that we're going to have to go through probably a competitive bidding process. We're going to have to put out an RFP, a request for proposals. And then all these contractors will then submit sealed bids to us. We'll then identify a time and date and location where we will open all those sealed bids. We will then award the contract to the bid that is the lowest from the most responsible and responsive bidder. So if we get a bid that is the lowest price tag, and that's from a bidder that we trust, and the bid meets the requirements of the request for proposal, that's how we then award the project. That's competitive bidding, and that's oftentimes required in the public sector for the purposes of ethical adherence and accountability. So you don't have nepotism, so you don't have favoritism, so you don't have a contractor who gives X amount of money to a city council member, and then that city council member goes and awards that contractor with millions of dollars in business. That's what we need to try and avoid, because we are dealing obviously with public taxpayer money. So we have good reasons why we have these different steps we have to go through and these different requirements we need to follow when we're doing things such as contracting. It makes us less efficient though. It'd be far more efficient, far quicker for us if we could just negotiate with one contractor and use that contractor. But that's not fair, but that's not necessarily ethical. So accountability can sometimes get in the way of doing the work as efficiently and effectively as possible. And there's also concern that when we have too many accountability standards, we have too many ethical rules and laws and requirements, that it will deter qualified people from coming into the public sector. That they're not going to want to deal with all these rules and these regulations, and so they're happier staying in the private sector, where sometimes they don't have to deal with those same rules and regulations. So sometimes when we have strict accountability standards, it does make it difficult for us to continue to attract the best and the brightest administrators to public service. So there are certainly difficulties with holding people accountable and having rigorous ethical standards. But clearly it's important, because again, we are not dealing with our money. We're not dealing with our resources. We're dealing the public's money, and we're dealing with public resources. And so therefore we need to be held accountable for how we are handling those resources. So over the years, there have been different approaches to accountability that have been used in public administration. The first approach to accountability is what's known as the legal boundaries approach. And this goes back to this politics administration dichotomy of Woodrow Wilson. So elected officials are the policymakers. So they operate on the politics side of the equation. Administrators are the implementers of those policies. They operate on the administration side of the equation. So what Woodrow Wilson told us in his famous article was that we can create a study of administration if we can pull administration out of politics. If we can separate the administrative world from the political world, then we can concentrate on making administration as efficient as we can possibly make it, doing what he calls the business of government. And we can then deal with administration in the public sector in a similar way to which we deal with administration in the private sector. And so that's what this politics administration dichotomy is. Applying that politics administration dichotomy to accountability and ethics means that there's a line of demarcation between politics and administration that administrators do not cross. And so if we anticipate administrators will only remain in that administrative side of the equation, then if we do see administrators straying over to the political side, that's going to be an ethical violation. That's something we can hold them accountable for, because they're not supposed to be playing politics. They're supposed to be administrators kind of doing this benign, objective management and administration of policies and programs. So under the legal boundaries approach to accountability, you make that separation. And so it is unethical for those administrators to be engaging in playing politics in the world of policymakers and elected officials. Pretty quickly, though, students of public administration realized that there wasn't really a practical distinction because we came to understand very quickly that administrators are not only involved in policy execution, the implementation of a policy, they're also involved in the formulation of that policy as well, because they bring a certain level of expertise to policy making. And so elected officials oftentimes rely upon the advice that they get from the administrators who will eventually be implementing those policies and will use that advice then in the formulation of that policy. So in your second school there, the political challenges approach, it was a recognition that when laws are passed by legislative bodies, they are oftentimes unclear and they are impossible to translate into transparent and predictable administrative actions. What that means is that if you're going to get something passed through Congress, you have 435 members of the House and 100 members of the Senate. The House and the Senate are probably going to be evenly divided in terms of party affiliation, or pretty evenly divided, which means that the more specifics that you put into a policy or a law, the less likely it is you're going to get majority approval for that law. So you kind of leave those laws non-specific. You kind of leave them vague in nature. And by leaving them vague in nature, there's not a whole lot of direction to administrators in terms of how to implement those laws. So administrators, in order to implement the laws, then have to write the rules that will govern implementation. And as they write these rules that will govern implementation, they're inherently doing policy formulation. I mean, that's part of policy formulation, is writing those rules. So we see a bleeding over between the politics and the administrative world. So a clear demarcation between politics and administration, like we saw in the politics administration dichotomy, is just simply not possible. We came to that realization, which then led us to question whether it was possible at all to impose ethical standards and accountability standards on administrators. And there was a discussion throughout the 1940s about whether it was even possible to have these external accountability controls that we could place upon administrators to make them accountable for what they are doing. The more modern approach to accountability is this evolving policy problems approach. And what this basically means is that we've come to realize that there's no longer a hierarchical chain of command or any single professional norm or expectation that we can hold administrators to. But rather, every organization, every agency has its own culture. And so when we are trying to hold people accountable, it's not as simple as saying, here is a rule or law that was passed by Congress, you must do this. We have to take into account the individual culture within that organization. And so holding people accountable today in our modern approach to accountability is a much more contextual, situation-based type of an approach, where it's not just a matter of having external controls, but we have to take into account the internal culture in the organization and that individual employee and have them hold themselves accountable as well. It's very much a balance, very much of a combination of external rules and regulations and internal approaches and internal training of public administrators in order to achieve that heightened accountability. So we really have very much a complex world now, where we have this blending of politics and administration and what administrators do. And we have these different organization cultures that we also have to take into account when trying to hold people accountable for their actions. But when we try and hold people accountable for their actions, there are different elements of accountability, different ways in which we hold them accountable. One way we hold people accountable, and this is the most common way, is through what we call fiscal accountability. And this is why we have audits and requirements for audits. In fiscal accountability, we are concerned with whether agency officials are spending money that they are, on the programs they are charged with, and only on those programs. So are they spending the money in the legally mandated way in which they're supposed to spend that money? So we look at how they're managing their monetary resources. Whenever we do audits, this would be an example of a financial or a legal audit. So you do financial legal audits to make sure that people are not mismanaging money, that the money is being spent in the way in which the policymakers, the elected officials, intended with the legislation that they adopted. So when we talk about accountability, we're oftentimes holding people accountable fiscally in how they are spending the money. But a second type of accountability is process accountability. Process accountability looks at the implementation and is concerned with how agencies are performing their tasks. So it goes beyond just, is the money being spent on the correct appropriations? But instead, we're asking the question, how well are we spending the money in terms of implementing these policies and these programs? How efficiently are we spending the money? So are we doing an efficient job of spending the resources that are being provided to us? That's what's called process accountability. It looks at policy implementation. Then the third element of accountability, a third approach, is program accountability. In program accountability, we are concerned with whether a public program has achieved its purpose, its goals, and its objectives as defined by law. So here we're looking at the outcomes of the programs that we are implementing. Are these programs meeting the wants, needs, and desires of the citizens that we are serving? Are these programs achieving the outcomes and achieving the programmatic and policy goals? So this is a very goal-oriented type of approach to accountability. We hold people and agencies accountable for achieving their goals and their objectives. At the federal level, every federal agency today must fill out a performance activity report. And in that performance activity report, they have to report how well they achieved their goals and how much progress they've made toward the achievement of their goals. And how well they have progressed toward the achievement of their goals will then dictate how much money they get in the next round of appropriations. So there are some real punitive measures that if you're not achieving your goals, you're going to lose money or potentially lose money in the next appropriations go around. So we are really holding agencies accountable for how well they're achieving their goals today. That's an example of program accountability. We have all three of those elements of accountability today at all levels of government. We want to make sure money is being spent the way in which it's legally appropriated with fiscal accountability. And that's where a lot of people get into trouble whenever we see stories of unethical behavior on the part of administrators. It's oftentimes in terms of not spending the money the way in which it's supposed to be spent. But we also want to make sure that the implementation is being done in an efficient manner with process accountability. And we want to make sure that these public agencies are achieving their goals through program accountability. So we kind of combine all three of those elements of accountability together in the way in which we enforce accountability and adherence to ethical principles today. So how do we do it? How do we hold people and how do we hold agencies accountable? The solution for how we hold agencies and people accountable really hinges on this balance between external controls, external rules and regulations and oversight, and internal forces such as the character and the training of the administrators within those organizations. And you need a combination of both the external controls as well as internal training and orientation of employees. The problem is that if you only rely upon external controls, there is a theory in public administration that's known as the paradox of tighter control. I'll put that in text chat. The paradox of tighter control. Sometimes it's referred to as the law of counter control. Same type of thing. But in the paradox of tighter control, the more controls, the more you try and control a subordinate, the more time and resources and effort that subordinate will put into trying to circumvent those rules and those regulations. So instead of spending their time and their resources trying to achieve the goals of a program, they will instead put their time and resources into circumventing the rules that have been placed upon them. Well, whenever they get entrepreneurial and they find ways of circumventing those rules, what then happens? Well, then you have more external rules placed upon those organizations, and those organizations will spend even more time and resources trying to circumvent those new rules. So external controls alone will not be good enough. We need a balance of the external and the internal. And one of the ways we maintain that balance between external controls and internal characteristics and internal training of administrators is through the protection of what we call whistleblowers. So oftentimes, whenever there are unethical things that are going on within an organization, it may be difficult to see those unethical things from outside. You really need someone within the walls of the organization to see those unethical behaviors and be able to report those unethical behaviors. Whenever people see unethical behaviors going on within their organization, they essentially have a choice. They can either become the voice, which means they remain within their organization and point out these unethical policies, these unethical behaviors, in which they become whistleblowers, or they exit the organization and they leave the organization because they disagree with how things are being done within that organization. Hopefully, not everyone will leave the organization. We will have some whistleblowers who will remain within the organization and become the voice of ethics. But in order for those people to feel secure remaining within the organization and being these whistleblowers, we need to protect them. And we protect them through what's called the Whistleblowers Act. And so back in 1989, we had the passage of this thing called the Whistleblowers Act. The Whistleblowers Act made it illegal to have retribution or reprisal against whistleblowers. And so we have protections that are given to these whistleblowers. They cannot be demoted, they cannot be terminated, they cannot be otherwise deprived of benefits by just merely the fact that they are blowing the whistle on these unethical types of behaviors. The better you can protect your whistleblowers, the more likely it is you will have that internal check within the organization that will then help enforce those external controls that you're getting through legislation and ethical codes and ethical principles. So the real solution to accountability is balancing external controls with that internal voice and having those people within the organization who are willing to point out unethical behavior. But at least in theory, in the public sector, we tend to deal with some more rigorous ethical standards than what you might see in the private sector. And again, the reason why we have this ethical upgrade, if you will, in the public sector is because we're dealing with public money. And so therefore, we're being held accountable. We're not only dealing with public taxpayer money, but we're also dealing with people's individual constitutional rights. And so we really have these high standards that we need to be held to when we are dealing with people's money and dealing with people's constitutional rights. The problem is that when people come from the private sector into the public sector, this ethical upgrade, if you want to call it that, is sometimes a shock and is sometimes very frustrating, because some of the things you used to do in the private sector, even though it was very valid, there was nothing wrong with what you were doing, when you come into the public sector, you have a lot more hoops that you have to jump through. You know, the contracting example is, again, a perfect example. If you're a private company, you can contract with pretty much whomever you want to come and build that building for you or provide whatever services you need provided. In the public sector, you have to go through a competitive bidding process. Now, not always, it depends on the situation, but frequently you have to go through that competitive bidding process. Many years ago, I taught an introduction to public administration class. And by many years, I'm talking about in the 1990s, that many years ago. And in that intro to the PA class, one of the main topics we started out with was the differences between public and private sector and public and private sector ethics. And this was like back in 1996 or 1997. And one of the case studies that we used was the case study involving Donald Trump and the renovation of the Central Park ice rink in New York City. So this was long before Donald Trump ran for president, long before he became president. This was when he was a business mogul in New York City. And just to make a long story short, the city of New York wanted to renovate the ice rink in Central Park. For many years, they wanted to do that. But they kept falling behind. They were running over their budget, and the ice rink was not getting done. So Donald Trump comes in and says, turn the project over to me and I'll be able to get the project done on time and under budget. So the city turned the project over to Trump Enterprises, and they indeed were able to get the ice rink done, and they were able to get it done relatively quickly and brought it in at a lower price tag than what the city was going to be able to pay. Well, the question is, how was that done? Clearly, the question's answered by the differences between the public and private sector. One of the major differences was contracting. that the Trump organization, or Trump Enterprises at that time, did not need to do any competitive bidding. They could just use contractors they had used for some of their previous projects and told those contractors, if you don't get this done on time, then we're not going to give you any more contracts in the future. So those contractors would put all their time and all their resources into getting this ice rink done on time. Well, for the city, they had to do a competitive bidding process. And then even when they selected a contractor, it was difficult for them to hold that contractor accountable for getting the job done on time. They could find the contractor every day that it was late, but that doesn't carry the same substance as telling that contractor, you're never going to work in this town again. And so I think it was really those differences between the sectors and some of the ethical standards we have to abide by, and contracting requirements we have to abide by in the public sector, that just made it so much easier for the private sector and someone like Trump to come in and get the project done much, much quicker and much less expensive. So we do have these additional regulations and hoops that we need to jump through in the public sector, which again can be very frustrating. Jay, go ahead.
If my memory suits correctly, that I think that ice rink was managed by Trump's either son-in-law or something, that they were somehow, that's what wound up after it was all done. I found that interesting at that point.
Yeah, they were I'm not going to, well, I guess I won't say nepotism. There were certainly folks who were hired that would not be allowed to be hired in the public sector. We'll put it that way. And so, yeah, the management, the operation of the ice rink looked a lot different than it would have looked if it was completely managed by the city of New York. So you're right. And yeah, just kind of highlight some of these different standards and different approaches between public and private sector. So our concern is obviously, if we have all these regulations, we have all these ethical adherence requirements in the public sector, does it make it difficult for us to bring in skilled administrators from the private sector into the public sector? And sometimes it is difficult. So what we have to do is strike a balance between holding people accountable for what they are doing and how they are doing it, while at the same time freeing them up to be creative and to be innovative and to be able to try new things. Sometimes there are new things you can try that you worry about trying those new things because they may, on paper, run afoul of what the agency's always done in the past. And so you might be criticized about doing something unethical when really it's just not in accordance with what the agency's done in the past. So too many rules and regulations can really lead us down the road toward inefficiency and ineffectiveness. We really have to find that balance where we hold people accountable, but we still give them enough freedom so that they can do their job creatively and they can do their job efficiently and effectively. When we get next week into a discussion of organization theory, I don't know if we'll have time to talk about him, but there is an organization theorist by the name of Merton. And Merton makes the argument that organizations, as they age and start to develop all these rules and all these regulations, they begin to see these rules and regulations as the goals, as opposed to the goal being serving citizens and accomplishing programmatic outcomes. So whenever your goal becomes adhering to rules and regulations, this is what Merton referred to as a bureaucratic dysfunction. And bureaucrats become dysfunctional once they have too many rules and too many regulations, and those rules and regulations become their primary goal and supplants the goal of servicing citizens. And that oftentimes does happen with these public sector organizations. So we got to try and find that balance. One way we can attract people into the public sector, despite all these rules and regulations they have to adhere to for the purposes of accountability and ethical adherence, is by making the public service appealing. Now, there is a very famous book many years ago by a man named Charles Goodsell. Put that in text chat. Charles Goodsell. And Charles Goodsell wrote this book called The Case for the Bureaucracy. And in The Case for the Bureaucracy, he made the argument that bureaucracy basically had become a dirty word. That whenever people thought about bureaucracy, they thought about all these negative things, such as red tape, such as being impersonal, such as gridlock, not getting the job done. People always had these negative views of bureaucracy. And Goodsell makes the argument that people oftentimes have a negative view of the bureaucracy because of their last interaction with an organization. That they may have 100 interactions with a government organization, and 99 of those interactions may be good. But if that last interaction is negative, it leaves a bad taste in their mouth, and then they look down upon bureaucracy, and they kind of judge all of bureaucracy in the entire public sector based upon that one negative interaction with that one agency, or perhaps even a negative interaction with that one public administrator. So Goodsell argued that we as public administrators need to sell bureaucracy. We need to sell the public sector by showing people how important the public sector is in their daily lives. As we'll talk about after the break, government touches just about every aspect of our lives, whether it be the roads we drive on, the safety of the products that we use, the safety of the food that we consume. Just about everything we do on a daily basis is touched in one way or another by government. But oftentimes citizens don't think about that. And they only think about the negative experiences that they've had with government and bureaucratic organizations. So we kind of need to sell the bureaucracy and sell the public sector and show people how indispensable the public sector is. You know, George H.W. Bush referred to government service as being the highest and noblest calling. Barack Obama, during his 2008 campaign, said that his goal was to try and make government and public service cool again. It's complicated. Public service is complicated, but if we can show people that it is a fulfilling vocation and it has the potential to impact the lives of many, many people in many, many different ways, and that you can make a difference in government, you can make a difference in the public sector, that's how we can still attract some of the best and the brightest, despite having these very rigorous and sometimes very complex accountability standards and ethical principles. But we do know that we have some external controls. Those external controls come from government code, from legislation. They also come from the codes of conduct of different professional organizations. And as we had talked about last week, our organization, professional organization that we all share, regardless of whether we're engineers or budget analysts or whatever the case may be, the American Society for Public Administration. And we covered these 8 different principles. You picked 3 of them and talked about them in Canvas essay number 2. But it is important that we do have these ethical principles that we try and abide by when we are working in the public sector. But we also know that there is a contextual basis to how many ethical principles we have and what we have to adhere to, depending upon what government we are working in. Here in the state of California, California tends to have some very rigorous sunshine laws and some very rigorous ethical laws that are promulgated for administrators in California to follow. And here in California, we try and achieve ethical adherence primarily through heightened transparency, that we want to make the governing process, the administrative process, as transparent as possible. And through that transparency, by letting the sun shine in, that's how we're going to be able to hold people accountable to their ethical standards. So all of us work here in, I think almost all of us work here in California. So we're probably familiar with some of these transparency requirements that we have here in the state of California. You're probably familiar with the Brown Act. The Brown Act has certain requirements for the meeting of public bodies. So it says that public bodies need to meet in public. And so in the Brown Act, you can have what are called open and closed sessions. The vast majority of the business of any governing body, whether it be a city council or board of supervisors, whatever the case may be, those meetings must be in open session. Those decisions must be made in open session. There are a very limited number of decisions that can be made in closed session. Closed session decisions include things such as, personnel decisions, where it could, invade the privacy rights of personnel who are subject to those personnel decisions. And so if you make a decision that someone is going to be terminated, that decision is made in closed session, but it's reported out in open session, but it's usually reported out with employee number rather than employee name. Conversations with your legal counsel, those can be done within closed session as well. But they can only be done in closed session for pending and anticipated litigation and only in the presence of your legal counsel. So you can't have a city council that feels like it's going to get sued for something it did, get together in closed session and come up with a strategy. That's not allowed under the Brown Act. You have to have your legal counsel there and be receiving legal advice from your legal counsel. So closed session topics are very limited. Most everything needs to be done in open session before the public. You have agenda requirements that your meetings have to be agendized at least 72 hours in advance and published in a public place. You have requirements in terms of public participation in these open meetings. You have must have a public comment period. Here in California, how much time you afford for those public comments is left up to the governing body, whether it be a city council or school board. They can decide, but it must be a reasonable standard that they apply. And so most organizations will have a 2 or 3 minute limit on individual public comments. Some will have a 20 or 30 minute limit per topic, but you have to have that type of public participation. We also have the Public Records Act here in the state of California. So any citizen or anyone in California who wants to know the decision-making process on any issue can put in a public records request. And a public records request here in California is somewhat similar to a FOIA, a Freedom of Information request for the federal government. Here in California, there are public records requests if you want to see all the documentation for a decision that a city council has made on an issue. You can put in a public records request and ask for all records that in which there was a discussion of the decision for this issue. And then that organization has 10 days to then respond, pull together all the information, and then give that information to that requester. That means that if the members of the city council, send emails to each other, those emails are discoverable. If they send text messages to each other on their personal phones, those messages are discoverable as well. All that information is then subject to a public records request. It's also important to note, going back to the open meetings, that if you have a majority of your members, then a majority of members, that meeting must be in the open. If you have 5 city council members, 2 city council members can have a conversation with each other, and that's acceptable under the Brown Act. Once you loop in that third person, then it must be an agendized open meeting, and then it's under the provisions of the Brown Act. And there are a lot of nuances there in terms of daisy chain and serial meetings, but for the most part, most of these decisions need to be made in open session just to protect yourself under the Brown Act. But again, public records requests, that's transparency. We have here in California more transparency than we typically see in a lot of other states. If you're in a reportable position, you have to file a Form 700, which is a conflict of interest form, where you have to disclose any potential conflicts of interest you may have with the duties that you are doing as this official. So a lot of positions in the Cal State system, management positions, are Form 700 conflict of interest positions. They're reportable positions. You have to fill out this Form 700. And so the Form 700, if you never filled one out, what you need to do is you need to disclose things such as any real estate holdings beyond just your primary residence that are within the jurisdiction. You have to disclose those. Any income that you are earning within the jurisdiction, you have to disclose that income as well, and who you are working for, again, to make sure that you don't have a conflict of interest, that you are not providing contracts and favors to your employers as opposed to other bidders. And again, we've got a lot of these transparency requirements, and California really approaches the achieving ethical adherence through these transparency types of requirements. We are very much what's referred to as a sunshine state here in the state of California. So let's pull all this together. We've been going for about an hour now, so let's pull all this together and talk about very briefly again, how do we achieve ethical adherence? How do we hold administrators accountable? And again, holding people accountable is really based upon striking this balance, where we need to have these external controls to hold people responsible and accountable, but at the same time, we also want people to be free to make decisions and take risks and be creative. And so we got to try and balance that. So we have our stringent external controls, but too many controls will make it difficult for people to be innovative, and also difficult for us to recruit the best and the brightest into the public sector. So we need both external controls as well as ethical training for our employees, as well as hiring employees with the characteristics who understand what it means to be in the public service and understand the higher ethical standards associated with managing public money and public resources. So it's important that we find this balance between ethical adherence and effectiveness so that we can still meet the demands of the public. Again, as you look across the nation, there are different ethical standards and different rules and regulations for different states. Here in California, we tend to have some very rigorous rules and regulations as compared to, my home state of Ohio. Their ethical standards for public administrators tend to be much less strict than what you tend to see here in California. So you don't necessarily only see an shock of ethical upgrade when you go from the private to the public sector, but you also see shock of ethical upgrade if you go from public employment in one state to public employment in another state. As we go through the rest of this class, especially when we get into our module talking about management of human and management of fiscal resources, we are going to return to this topic of ethics and accountability, and we'll talk about some of these specific standards and some of the specific regulations that we have to adhere to when we are managing civil servants and when we are managing budgets in finance. And we'll talk about that later on in a future class session. And you'll also continue to cover this information as you go into your future core courses as well. So that's just kind of an overview of ethics and accountability to get you going in the program. Again, it's the first time that you may have been talking about this topic in the program, but it certainly will not be the last time. So are there any general questions or observations or comments on any of this material on accountability and ethics?
One quick question. So everything's supposed to be like the money prescribed for a certain project or program. And some people I know try to save money, try to look at other ways to perform the services or deliveries. But some people say just spend the money, and then you'll get the same amount plus 1.5% next whatever. Is that true, or what do you think? What's your experience? Dave?
Yeah, that's a great question. That is true. I mean, what we have is that sometimes we have agencies that they're concerned that if they save too much money and they have money left in their budget at the end of the year, then budget makers are going to look at for next year and say, well, you have money left over, so therefore we're going to cut your appropriation. You don't need all the money that we gave you. And so that's why we end up with things like at the Pentagon, the $800 golden toilet seats. You've heard the stories about the Pentagon. Yeah, some of that inefficient spending, you see that because they just have to spend the money so they get as much or more money in the next fiscal year. And that is unfortunate. One of the ways in which you can try and get around that problem is by having more flexibility in your appropriations. And one way in which you can have flexibility in your appropriations is what's called a no-year appropriation. And this is a budgetary device, a no-year appropriation, where you can give an appropriation to an agency, but it will be a no-year appropriation, meaning it's not just for that fiscal year. So they can spend that money in this fiscal year, but if they don't spend it all, then it's going to be for next fiscal year they can spend it, or the year after that, or the year after that. It's not just for one given fiscal year. So those no-year appropriations can allow us to kind of get around this inefficient spending at the end of the fiscal year, but it does mean a somewhat of a loss of control for budget makers as well, because it does give that additional flexibility for organizations. It also depends a lot on the type of money and the categorization of the money. So if the money is going into a general fund, oftentimes you have a lot more flexibility with that money in that general fund. And so what you can do is you can encumber it near the end of the fiscal year without actually spending it. And then when your appropriators look at it, they see that money's been encumbered, even though it's still there, and they won't penalize you in the next appropriation year. So you can always encumber funds and then unencumber them the next year and spend them on something else. Because in the general fund, you have a lot more flexibility in how you spend the money. However, if it's money that's in a more restrictive fund, such as a special revenue fund or an enterprise fund or a sinking or debt service fund, you don't have those same types of flexibility mechanisms. And so, yes, you kind of have to spend the money on what it's appropriated for in that fiscal year. And you're right, Jay, it does lead to a lot of that inefficient spending. So we've tried to rein some of that in but reining it in means giving more flexibility to agencies, and that's something that budget makers oftentimes are very hesitant to do. That's a great point. Good. Any other observations or questions? Okay. Well, it's 5:05, so I think it's a capital time for a break. So let's take a 10-minute break. Let's come on back at 5:15. We come back at 5:15. We'll turn our attention to talking about some of the differences between public administration and private administration and have a little discussion of Graham Allison's article. So take a break. Come on back at 5:15. Okay, welcome back, everyone. The 10 minutes goes by very quickly, I know, but let's shift gears now and start talking about public versus private administration and some of the differences, some of the similarities between the two. So this is a public administration program, and I know a lot of folks didn't have an undergraduate public administration class because a lot of universities don't offer that, but public administration itself is really the study of bureaucracies and organizations. And we know that these bureaucracies, these organizations are really everywhere. We encounter government with pretty much everything that we do on a daily basis, whether, again, it be the food we consume, the medicine we consume, the cars we drive, the roads we drive on, just about every aspect of our life. We're going to encounter government bureaucracy just about everywhere. And because we encounter government bureaucracy just about everywhere, bureaucracy is really the source of a lot of debate in terms of its inefficiencies, in terms of its red tape, in terms of it being impersonal. Typically, bureaucracy tends to have a very negative connotation. So let's talk a bit more about what bureaucracy is and how and why we study public bureaucracies. So public administration really is the study of public bureaucracies. And by public bureaucracies, we're referring to public organizations. So public organizations, which are formal, rational systems of relationships among persons vested with administrative authority to carry out public programs. And that's a kind of stilted definition of what a bureaucracy is. But it's an organization that is a formal organization that is designed to be rational in the way in which it makes its decisions. And these organizations are staffed by individuals who have administrative authority. Administrative authority, obviously, we're talking about power that is vested in them from legislation and from legislative bodies. And that power and that authority is vested in these bureaucrats for the purpose of being able to carry out public programs and public policies. So the important part of this definition is that these organizations are formal, they are rational, and there is a source of authority, a source of power and legitimacy that really underpins these organizations and the administrators who work within these organizations. But again, these bureaucratic organizations tend to have a very negative perception among the public. And the public tends to see bureaucracies as being too efficient to accomplish anything, but at the same time being made up of administrators who are very efficient at abusing power. So again, a very negative type of connotation that's associated with this term bureaucracy. But that's what we are studying primarily in public administration. We're studying these bureaucratic organizations. The problem for public administration over the years is that public administration really continues to suffer from a crisis of identity, in that public administration is always trying to demonstrate how it is different and distinct from private administration. You know, again, I had said this probably in our first class session, but when you told people you were getting an MPA degree, some people may have misunderstood you and understood you to say an MBA degree. And sometimes people don't know the differences between an MPA and an MBA degree. Because sometimes people don't know the differences between public administration and private administration. And we're going to spend tonight talking about some of those specific differences, but kind of at a macro level, a general level, one of the primary differences between public and private administration is this integral role of public authority. That public organizations are born out of, and they have the genesis for their power coming from legislation and coming from legislative bodies. And as such, they have this legitimacy. They have this public authority at their very core that private organizations do not share. And so that's a major difference between a public and a private organization. This whole idea of legal legitimacy, public authority. And another major category of differences are the processes that they use to organize themselves and do their daily business. There are some processes that are characteristic of the public sector. There are some processes that are characteristic of the private sector. Just take one example is employment. In the public sector, we have career civil service employment. In the private sector, we have at-will employment. For career civil servants, they have certain protections built into law so that they can only be dismissed for cause. They can only be dismissed for not doing their jobs and for not competently doing their jobs. And even when they are dismissed for cause, those dismissals need to be well documented. And so if you're going to terminate a public employee, you will have to have a performance evaluation. Then any deficiencies you see in that performance evaluation need to then attempt to be remedied through training and development opportunities. Then another performance evaluation, the deficiencies in that performance evaluation, you then offer more training and development opportunities. You have to have multiple instances of deficient performance and then evidence of training and development opportunities being provided to that individual before you can eventually go down the road toward termination, because they're a career civil servant. Not only do they have those career civil service protections, protections you see under laws like the 1883 Pendleton Act and the 1978 Civil Service Reform Act, but they oftentimes also have union protections as well. If they're unionized employees, they have a collective bargaining process which produces a contract. So on top of their civil service protections, they oftentimes have protections in the form of their contract as well. For at-will employees in the private sector, they can be dismissed for any cause that is legal. So certainly you can't dismiss someone that would be based upon racial discrimination or gender discrimination, but you have a much easier time dismissing at-will employees because there is not that same guarantee of employment that you have in the public sector with career civil servants. So that's just one example of some differences in the organizational processes between public versus private organizations. And we'll get more into that as we talked about the Graham Allison article. Both public and private sector both contribute to the idea of policy execution, the implementation of policy. So public sector organizations implement policy, but private sector organizations can contribute to that implementation as well. So if you have certain regulations that private organizations must adhere to, they are involved in the implementation of those regulations. However, when it comes to policy formulation, the actual creation of the policy, that's when you see a role for the public sector much more so than a role for the private sector. Now, granted, the private sector can create lobbying organizations and they can fund lobbying organizations to go out there and lobby Congress in policy formulation, but it's really public administrators in the public sector that's very intimately involved in policy formulation, in that those elected officials are going to ask the advice and counsel of the administrators who will be implementing this policy and this program on a daily basis. And so those implementers will be very much involved in the formulation of policy. So whereas we have both sectors involved in execution and implementation, it's really mostly the public sector that's involved in policy formulation. One good way to really illustrate the differences between the public and private organizations is with this thing called the Federal Anti-Deficiency Act. And this Federal Anti-Deficiency Act actually came into play at the end, well, partway through the Trump administration. And that if you remember in the Trump administration, we had a government shutdown. And in that government shutdown, one of the departments that was affected by that government shutdown was the Department of Treasury. And one part of the Department of Treasury is the Internal Revenue Service. So whenever we had this government shutdown, it meant that IRS agents had to stay home and they couldn't come to work and they couldn't process tax returns. And this occurred right when the tax season was really getting underway in January and February. Well, the Trump administration decided that they wanted to continue to pay IRS agents so that they would come to work, and so you wouldn't have this backlash from taxpayers saying they can't get their questions answered, they can't get their taxes filed. Well, that was a violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act because there was no appropriated funds that were available to pay for those IRS agents. And so therefore, you can't just go and pay the money that you don't have that has not been appropriated by Congress. Because the Federal Anti-Deficiency Act says that forbids government officials from spending on all that is not explicitly authorized by law. So if we are going to spend money on something, it must be explicitly authorized under law, that Congress must pass a law, appropriation bill that gives us the authority to go out there and spend that money on that expenditure. In this instance, there was no congressional authority to spend money to pay the salaries of IRS agents. And so that's why it was considered a violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act. However, for private organizations can spend on anything that they want to spend money on as long as it's not forbidden by the law. So in the public sector, we can only spend on what is permitted by the law. The private sector can spend on anything as long as it's not forbidden by the law. And you see that's a huge difference in terms of our flexibility and our latitude in how we can spend money. So I think the Anti-Deficiency Act is a really good illustration of some of the major differences between the public and the private sector. I think Graham Allison in his article does a really nice job of laying out for us some of the major similarities and differences between public and private sector organizations. And Allison titles his article, Public and Private Management, Are They Fundamentally Alike in All Unimportant Respects? So are they fundamentally alike in all unimportant respects? What do you think Allison means by that title? Are they fundamentally alike in all unimportant respects? What's he mean by that? Go ahead, Jim.
They, in my opinion, they all have budgets, they all spend money, they all have infrastructure, they all have other aspects that represent, they're similar across both private and public. It's just like you were saying, the accountability is different and the rules are slightly, if not more, different, that kind of thing. It's like rules of the game, I think, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And you're certainly right that there are some things that are certainly similar. He says, are they fundamentally alike? And they are fundamentally alike. They're fundamentally alike in some of these basic management functions that you mentioned, Jay. Things such as, if you're running a public organization or if you're running a private organization, you have to have a budget. You have to hire people. You have to engage in staffing. You have to organize your agency. You have to coordinate efforts within your organization. You have to have some reporting mechanisms for how you are accomplishing, how well you're accomplishing your goals and your objectives. You have to engage in strategic planning to plan the operations of your organization. Those are what Allison refers to as generic management functions. And he says, in terms of those generic management functions, they're similar between public and private sector organizations. And so this is what we'll see next week, came to be known as POSCORP. And POSCORP is kind of an acronym, but it stands for Planning, Organizing, Staffing, watch me type and talk at the same time, Directing, I'm going to misspell things, Directing, Coordinating, Reporting, and Budgeting. POSCORP, Planning, Organizing, Staffing, Directing, Coordinating, Reporting, and Budgeting. Those are basic generic management functions that go on equally in the public as well as the private sector. So are they fundamentally alike? Yes, they're fundamentally alike in these generic management functions. Are these management functions the really important things? Well, they're done by all organizations, but again, since all organizations do them, they're not important differences between the public and the private sector. So on those generic management functions, they're similar, public and private organizations. However, public and private organizations differ in some more important types of ways. So how public and private organizations differ. And he gives us a whole list. We're going to just pull out a few of the list to talk about tonight. One major way they differ that we mentioned earlier this evening, the career service. The public organizations have career civil servants, whereas the private sector will have at-will employees. When you have career civil servants, especially unionized career civil servants, you have a lot of rules and regulations that you have to adhere to. You have rules and regulations in terms of how you staff, how you recruit people. You have rules and regulations in terms of how you go through the selection process and select people. And not so much so today, but back in the day at the federal level, you have the Office of Personnel Management. And the Office of Personnel Management would then float all these job announcements, all these position descriptions, and then people would apply directly through OPM. The Office of Personnel Management would then administer an examination and would then score that examination. And we'll put together a list of either the top 3 or the top 5 scorers on that examination, and would then provide that eligibility list to the agency. The agency would then interview those 3 or those 5 off that eligibility list, and would then select who they want to hire. And then that hire would have to be go through Office of Personnel Management, be approved by the Office of Personnel Management. It was a very centralized type of hoops that you would have to jump through in hiring employees at the federal level. At the local level, we traditionally had these things called civil service commissions. And the Civil Service Commission would put together an examination. When I was in graduate school, I worked with the institute which worked with local governments in creating these examinations and trying to create valid examinations for these civil service commissions. And the civil service commissions would then implement the examinations, would score the examinations, put an eligibility list together, and kind of do the same type of thing in hiring that OPM did at the federal level. That's because we're hiring career civil servants, which means we want to make sure that we're doing an objective job of identifying the people who have the most merit for the position. So we're hiring the most qualified person for that position, not someone who supported the right political party, not someone who is a friend of a friend, the person who has the qualifications to do the job. And then these people, once they are hired, then they are managed, their performance is evaluated, and they are trained and developed, and they are sanctioned and disciplined according to civil service requirements, as opposed again to the flexibility you have in the private sector with at-will employees. So that's a huge difference between the two sectors. Performance measures also tend to differ between the two sectors as well. Our measurements for performance in the public sector tend to be much more qualitative as opposed to more quantitative measures in the private sector. Whenever you are trying to achieve something like an enhancement of the quality of life of citizens, quality of life is a more qualitative type of measure than the number of widgets that are being produced by an organization. So our performance measurements are a lot what we call softer in the public sector as compared to in the private sector. We have competing standards that we are held to in the public sector as compared to the private sector. We had said that the whole reason why we discuss American government and federalism and separation of powers is the major implication of the many masters theory. That in the public sector, we serve many masters. We serve the national government, state government, local governments. We serve executive, legislative bodies, the judiciary. And as such, all those different quote unquote masters can have different standards that we are being held to. So we have a lot more competing standards in the public sector than you might have in a private organization that can establish its own standards internally. There's obviously a lot more public scrutiny in the public sector compared to the private sector. It's that what we call the fishbowl effect, in that here in the public sector, we are scrutinized by the media, we're scrutinized by interest groups, we're scrutinized by citizens, we're scrutinized by consumer watchdog groups. We're scrutinized, and our activities are scrutinized by a lot of different entities. Here in California, because of our transparency requirements, there's a great deal of public scrutiny on the public sector, far more so than what you would see with a private sector organization. Our budgets are highly scrutinized, and we have to go through an approval process with our budgets. We have to make those budgets available for public comment. When I served on the school board, we had what we call the first interim and a second interim budget. those first and second interim budgets would have to have a public hearing where people can come and they can make comments on the budget. They can submit written comments on the budget. We had to go through that type of scrutiny in approving our budget. And then our budget went to the County Office of Education, where it was scrutinized again at the County Office of Education. Persuasion. In the public sector, we rely a lot more on persuasion than we may have to in the private sector. And the reason for that is that managers in the public sector don't have the same type of control that managers in the private sector have. In the public sector, because you're dealing with career civil servants, because you're oftentimes dealing with unionized employees, because you have very strict requirements on how you can spend your money, you don't have the ability to necessarily tell people what to do. You instead have to persuade them to take the actions you want them to take. And public managers need to have more power of persuasion because they don't have the same ability to direct people to do what they want them to do as in the private sector. There was, and it's not private, it's military, but there's a great example from when Harry Truman was president and whenever Eisenhower was elected president. Truman said that Eisenhower would be the most frustrated person or frustrated man in Washington, D.C., because Eisenhower was used to telling people jump and they would say, yes, sir, how high? When you're running the federal bureaucracy, it's hard to tell people to jump. You have to persuade them to jump, which is a much different way of leadership and management. Now, of course, a lot more oversight, as we've said many times in this class, in the public sector as compared to the private sector. We have direct oversight with legislative organizations, and that then introduces the whole idea of the fully informed advise that we talked about with the ASPA Code of Ethics, and it really does limit what we are able to do in the public sector. So just a very limited list of some of the major differences between public organizations and private organizations. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, you didn't mention profit. You didn't mention the bottom line and the lack of a bottom line, the lack of a profit motive in the public sector compared to the private sector. Yes, that is an important difference between the two sectors. It is a necessary difference, but it is not a solely sufficient difference. So usually when I would ask classes, what's the major difference between a public and private organization? They will say, well, there's no bottom line in the public sector and there's a profit motive in the private sector, which is absolutely true. But it's also true that there are some private non-governmental organizations that do not have a profit motivation. You know, private nonprofit organizations don't have a profit motivation, but they are still private and they are still non-governmental. We also have some government organizations that do have a profit incentive, things like government corporations, like the U.S. Postal Service. U.S. Postal Service is a government corporation. It oftentimes doesn't run a profit, but at least in theory is in existence to run a profit. That's a public organization, technically a public organization that has a profit incentive. So the profit, the bottom line argument is not solely sufficient for distinguishing between public and private sector organizations. It's a necessary but not sufficient type of distinction. Another distinction between public and private organizations that we talked about earlier is this difference between their activity in policy formulation versus policy execution. And I use the terms formation and formulation interchangeably in this class. So sometimes you'll see formulation, sometimes formation. I use them as the same term. So in policy formulation, we are putting the policy together, we are designing the policy. In policy execution, we are then implementing that policy after that policy has been passed. Again, public and private organizations both get involved in policy execution, but it's really only public organizations that are truly contributing to policy formulation. And that, again, is a major difference between the two. In policy execution, the task of public administration is to take a written law that has been given to them by the elected officials and to then translate that written law into action, to actually implement those policies. The important thing about in execution is it's not merely just implementing the laws, because as we had said before, those laws come to public agency oftentimes in a very vague, very amorphous type of format. And so it's then up to those public agencies to write the rules that will govern the implementation of those laws. Rulemaking is a very important part of the work done by administrative agencies. And we have requirements for how we do the rulemaking. And so whenever a public agency proposes a rule to govern implementation of a policy, they have to go through a public comment period. And so the public needs to have an opportunity to come in, to comment, to testify on those rule changes before those rule changes can be adopted. But by writing those rules and regulations, they are really having a big impact. Administrators are having a big impact upon how those policies will eventually then be implemented. And so whereas laws are created by elective legislatures and by chief executives through executive orders, it's really the administrators through rulemaking who have the opportunity to shape those laws into a reality. Then in terms of policy formulation, again, this is where it's primarily a public role as opposed to a private sector role. In policy formulation, before a policy is made, we see a lot of involvement of administrators advising elected officials, and elected officials will seek the advice of those who will be implementing this policy. Then even after a policy is made, even after a law is adopted, as we said before, through execution, you then have to write the rules and make sense of what the legislature's intent was and how this law should actually be implemented. Here in the state of California, we have a little phenomenon known as trailer bills. And so you'll see the state legislature pass a budget on June 15th. It'll be signed by the governor by June 30th. A new fiscal year will go into effect on July 1st. Then throughout July and August and September, the state legislature will then pass what are called trailer bills. Those trailer bills will spell out more specifically where money is going and how, and the eligibility requirements for different types of grant programs. Once you get that trailer bill as an administrative agency, you then have to make sense of that trailer bill and decide exactly how that money is going to be apportioned, exactly who gets the money, when they're going to get the money, and how you're going to apply those guidelines that were given to you in those trailer bills. So there's a whole lot of decision making that goes on the policy formulation side, even after the policy has been passed by the legislative body. Well, so what? You know, one of my big questions always is, so what? Well, so what? So we have administrators who are involved in policy formulation. What does that mean? Well, what that has meant is that the more involvement we get from public administrators in policy formulation, the more technical our public policies tend to be, because you have the specialized competence and the specialized expertise of members of administrative agencies that are being brought to bear onto the design of this policy. So the more expertise you have involved in the design, the more technical those policies tend to become. And also when you are involving administrative agencies from the executive branch in policy formulation, it expands the chief executive's role, because the chief executive is in charge of the executive branch, in charge of those administrative agencies. So when those administrative agencies have a bigger role to play in policy formulation, that's when the chief executive has a bigger role to play as well. So those are two of the major so what's. Well, administrators are involved in policy formulation. Well, so what? Well, it makes our policies more technical in nature, and it also enhances the power of the chief executive. So again, one of those major differences between the sectors, we've got public and private sector both engaged in policy execution, but primarily only the public sector that's engaged in doing a lot of this policy formulation. Now, next week, you will read this article by Woodrow Wilson that talks about the politics administration dichotomy. And that dichotomy is important here because whenever we're talking about administrators being involved in formulation of policy, we're talking about the role of administrators bleeding over into the political world. And that's why today administrators not only play an administrative role, but they also play a political role as well. But back in the Wilson article, which he wrote back in 1887, it was called The Study of Administration, that again, you're going to be reading then for next week. Woodrow Wilson suggests for us that we should concentrate on studying administration. That if we can separate politics and administration in this politics administration dichotomy, what we'll be able to do is then focus squarely on the business of government, on the administrative side, and we can then make the administration of government more efficient. But we can only do that if we can pull the politics out. And so that's why his article has come to be known as the politics administration dichotomy. Now, one of the things that Wilson talks about in this article that you'll read for next week is that if we are able to pull politics out of administration and we're able to create this separate field of study known as public administration, what we can then do is we can look to other nations with different political cultures, and we can borrow administrative innovations from those other countries and bring them into the US. So for instance, he said, we can look at Britain. And England had their own system of career civil service. We didn't create career civil service here in this country. England already had a system of career civil service. We could look over to England's system of career civil service. We could bring it over, borrow it, and apply it to our system of administration. And we can do that as long as we are kind of divorcing politics and administration. So we did that. We took the career civil service system from England and we used it to create our civil service in the Pendleton Act in 1883. But here's the big caveat. Even though Wilson talks about this politics administration dichotomy, the recognition, even with Wilson, is that, as he says in his article, politics are the touchstone of administration. So even when we bring an innovation from England, like career civil service, and apply it to our administrative structure, we always do have to remember that our political culture is different, or was different, than the British system, than the British political culture. In England, in order to hire the most qualified people in their civil service system, they used a system of closed competitive examinations. Those competitive examinations were closed to only certain individuals. So not everyone could sit for those examinations to then earn a job in the British civil service. Well, we like the idea of examinations, so we borrowed examinations and we applied it to our system of civil service in the Pendleton Act in 1883, but with a caveat. We knew that a closed system of exams would not work as well for us because we had a more open expectation in terms of political culture. And so we had to take those closed examinations and we transformed them into open examinations. So anyone was able to sit for those competitive exams to then earn a position in the American career civil service. So we had to modify examinations to make them fit our unique political culture. Another example is that the career civil service system in England was a very closed system, in that if you ran a company or ran a corporation, you decide you wanted to move into the British civil service system, you would have to start at the bottom and work your way up. So even if you were a CEO of a corporation, if you want to go to work for the government, you would have to start at the bottom of the civil service system and then over the years work your way back up to the top. We knew that wouldn't work here in the US because, again, our different political culture. So we took that career civil service system and we made it an open lateral entry system so that you don't have to start at the bottom and work your way up. You can enter laterally into our system of career civil service. And that's true today. At the federal level, our civil service system is called the general schedule. And in that general schedule, it's a position classification system that has different steps to it, different grades and different steps. Starts at a GS1, general service 1 position, and general schedule 1 position, and moves up to today a general schedule 15 position. Above that is what's called the senior executive service, and we'll get into a discussion of that when we talk about managing human resources. But the basic career civil service runs from the GS1 up to a GS15. Well, you graduate from this program with your MPA, and if you have an MPA plus you have a few years of experience working in local government, and you decide you want to transition into the federal civil service, you would probably enter into the federal civil service somewhere around probably about a GS10 or a GS11 position. You wouldn't have to start down at GS1, you could come in at GS10 or GS11. That's that lateral entry. We have lateral entry for CEOs who want to come into the public bureaucracy and become an assistant director of an agency. They can move into the senior executive service at an upper level type of leadership position. So that's how we transformed the British civil service system to make it match our unique political culture. So even though Wilson is known for the politics administration dichotomy, even Wilson recognized that we always have to keep politics in mind whenever we are designing the administrative structures to try and make administration as efficient as possible. So today, most students of public administration reject the politics administration dichotomy because it's obvious that administrators kind of bleed over into that political world in terms of doing policy formulation types of functions. But even though we have administrators who are very much involved in the political side, in the policy formulation side of the equation, we still have to recognize that the motivations and behaviors of policymakers and public administrators are very different. And this is a key issue for the field of public administration. Policymakers, elected officials, have a primary motivation of re-election. And David Mayhew told us this 50 years ago in his book, Congress, the Electoral Connection, where he says the primary motivation of a member of Congress is to get reelected. And they do a variety of things in order to get reelected. In order to get reelected, they are going to advertise their name. They're going to get their name out there, so they'll get reelected. They will take positions, very high-profile positions on very non-controversial issues, position taking. And most notably, they will engage in credit claiming, where they will claim credit for very popular projects and very popular policies. And that all those behaviors are done in order to try and get reelected, because that's their primary motivation. Public administrators are not concerned about getting reelected. They're in the career civil service, so they have a different motivation. Their motivation may be for career advancement, their motivation may be for good policy, but those different motivations will lead to different behaviors than what we typically see from elected officials who are motivated by re-election. But the important takeaway from this, as you read the Wilson article for next week, is this idea of the politics administration dichotomy, and that it's not a complete separation. And we understand today it cannot be a complete separation, because politics will always be the touchstone of our administration, and administrators will always be involved in not only policy execution, but policy formulation as well. So what does this mean for our study of public administration, our study of these public organizations, these public bureaucracies? Well, one generalization we can make about the study of public administration is that public administration is timeless, but yet it is also time-bound. But what do we mean by that? We mean that there are some aspects of administration that are true throughout the years, regardless of the era that we are looking at. So you go back to those generic management functions. It doesn't matter if you're running an organization in the 1920s or in the 2020s, you are still going to have to engage in planning and hiring staff and managing budgets and reporting and organizing. Those things are pretty much timeless, but they're going to occur regardless of when you are doing your administration of an agency. But public administration is also time-bound in that the way we do those things is different. And this is kind of the real takeaway from the Allison article, is that what we do may be similar, but how we do it is the major distinction between public and private sectors. Again, what we do may be similar, those generic functions, but how we go about doing those generic functions, that will be much different between the two different sectors. So how we manage personnel in the 1920s was a lot different than how we manage personnel today. In the 1920s, we were governed primarily by this theory known as scientific management, whereby we would essentially come up with the one best way to do the job, teach people how to do the job in the one best way, micromanage them to make sure they're doing the job in the one best way, and evaluate them on doing that job in the one best way. It's a very top-down, hierarchical, micromanagement type of approach. Today, the way we manage employees is much more along the lines of human empowerment and employee empowerment, allowing people more ability to self-govern, to self-direct, to develop their skills and abilities that they want to develop to help them grow as human resources. So even though we're still doing our staffing function, we're just doing it differently today in this time period as compared to how we would have done it back in the 1920s. Public administration is universal, but it's also culture bound and varies according to the situation. So there are some universal maxims in public administration. You treat people well, you treat people with respect, and we know that they will respond better than if you don't treat them with respect. That's kind of a universal maxim. But every organization has its own culture, and every situation is different. This is why my favorite answer to questions in public administration is always, it depends. It depends upon the situation. It depends upon the context of the problem that you are dealing with. Every organization has a different culture. So how you manage people in the Department of Agriculture or the Department of Health and Human Services, which are massive, huge departments, will probably be different than the way in which you manage people in the Marine Mammal Conservation Board, because you've got a much smaller, much more egalitarian organization. When we talk about organization theories in the second half of class next week, we'll talk about a theory known as organization culture. And we'll talk about how different cultures influence how we study different organizations in the public sector. So some maxims are universal, but we always have to remember the situation and lead by the situation in which we are dealing. And third, public administration is complex, but it's only intelligible, it's only understandable by simplified models or step-by-step combining of models, meaning that even though public administration is very complex, we can come up with theories and we can come up with models to help us predict behavior and to help us understand why people behave the way they do and why organizations do what they do in the public sector. And when you have a situation when you have the need to develop theories and develop models, that kind of moves you down the road toward becoming an academic discipline. And that's kind of how academic disciplines are formed. They are formed through the recognition that we can create discrete and unique models to help us understand the world around us. But we do know that there's a lot of complexity in the public sector. And we know that organizational systems are very complex. And so therefore, one single simple model is not going to be good enough to help us understand what's going on within those bureaucratic organizations. We need to come up with varied and more complex models to try and understand the complexity of the public sector. Well, the question becomes, why is the public sector so complex? What enhances its complexity? Well, there are a lot of complicating factors in the public sector that do make it very complex. One complicating factor is this interconnection between policy formulation and policy execution. I feel like we've been beating this theme a lot tonight, but there is certainly bleeding over and overlap between policy formulation and policy implementation. That overlap makes it very complicated in terms of how we pass and how we implement policies. Kind of blurs those lines between what policymakers do and what administrators do. There's a lot of need for coordination in that whenever we implement these programs and policies, oftentimes it's just not one agency that's implementing this policy. You have to coordinate with other agencies. State agencies coordinate with local agencies. Counties coordinate with cities. General purpose governments like cities and counties coordinate with special purpose governments like school districts. We coordinate with the private sector. We coordinate with nonprofit organizations. So all that coordination, all those moving parts, brings with it a lot of complexity. All this coordination means that there are multiple relationships that need to be managed in the public sector as well. And these relationships oftentimes have disparate levels of power, in that when you're talking about a relationship between a state agency and a local agency, because local governments, as we learned in our discussion of federalism, are creatures of the state, that means that there's a asymmetry in the power between that state agency and that local agency. Public administration floats in the seas of time. As we said before, it is sensitive to different time periods in that we approach what we do in the public administration differently depending upon the time period in which we are dealing. Some of our organizations or bureaucracies are very top-down hierarchical. Some of our organizations are much flatter and much more bottom-up in their hierarchical structure. So different structures of different agencies adds that complexity to our study of public administration as well. Information, and this is a huge one now for us today. We are swimming in this sea of information. Information is ubiquitous. We have to be good, knowledgeable consumers of information to make sure that we are acquiring and using credible information in making our decisions as administrators. The more information that is out there, the more difficult decision-making becomes. And then the way in which we structure organizations. Some organizations are very centralized in one office. Some organizations have field offices spread across the entire country. Department of Agriculture has regional and field offices all over the country, dozens upon dozens of field offices. Managing that organization is going to be a lot different than managing an organization that has one headquarters located in one location in Long Beach, California. And then values. In the public sector, we have a different set of values we emphasize as compared to the private sector. One of the primary values emphasized in the private sector obviously is going to be efficiency, trying to do more with less, trying to create more of a product with fewer inputs, because that will then enhance your profit margin. Efficiency is something we're concerned about as well here in the public sector, but we're also concerned with values such as effectiveness. So if efficiency is doing more with less, effectiveness is achieving our goals and our objectives. We're also very concerned about representative bureaucracy. We want our organizations to represent the constituents that they are serving. So we want to create a representative bureaucracy, which has strong implications for obviously how we recruit folks and how we hire folks and how we allocate work. We also have the protection of individual rights as another one of our values in public administration. We need to protect the constitutional rights of those individuals we come into contact with. Social equity is another major value of public administration. We need to try everything that we need to do in pursuance of social equity to make sure resources are equally and equitably, or really equitably distributed across society. So a pursuit of social equity, a pursuit of social justice are major goals and values within a public administration. Political responsiveness is another value in public administration. We need to be responsive to policymakers. We need to do that fully inform and advise principle in the ASPA Code of Ethics. So whereas the private sector focuses a lot of their attention on efficiency, we have a lot of other competing values in addition to efficiency. And sometimes some of those values really do contend with efficiency. That if you want to protect individual rights, you may have to spend more time and devote more attention to a single individual, a single case, which could hurt your efficiency. If you want to promote representative bureaucracy, you're probably going to have to do targeted recruitment, and you're going to have to go through a lot more processes in order to create that representative bureaucracy, as opposed to the way in which you may be able to hire in the private sector. So having all these competing values obviously adds a great deal to the complexity that we face in the public sector. Which means that the reality of the public sector, it's too complex to be explained by abstract theories, but it's not possible to just have one theory that we can use for everything we study in public administration. We need to have multiple complex theories to understand the behavior of administrators as well as the behavior of administrative organizations. When you have the need for multiple theories and the creation of all these different theories, you have the basis for what we consider to be an academic discipline. And we do have some time left tonight, so rather than hold this off for next week, let's just have a real brief discussion about what an academic discipline is, and then start our consideration of whether or not public administration can be considered to be an academic discipline. Now, again, some people view public administration, the study of public administration, as being a subfield within political science. In my training, I went into a political science program, and public administration was only one of my comprehensive examination areas. I had a field of public administration policy. I also had Congress, I had presidency, I had state and urban government. So it was just one of my 4 areas. It was clearly viewed as being a subfield of political science. Here we have a standalone MPA program in a standalone department, the Graduate Center for Public Policy Administration. So here at Long Beach, we view public administration differently than political science. Political science is a completely different college. They're in the College of Liberal Arts. We are in the College of Health and Human Services. Our offices are on the even side of the building. Political science is on the opposite side of the building in the odd number offices. And so we are separate from political science here at Long Beach. So we consider ourselves to be a separate academic discipline here at Long Beach, but not everyone considers public administration a separate academic discipline. So my first question to you is, when you think about an academic discipline, what are the elements of an academic discipline? Something like history or psychology or sociology, we think of those as being separate academic disciplines. What makes them an academic discipline? What are the elements of an academic discipline? Any ideas on some of the elements of a discipline?
They focus on a collected group of maybe similar focused subjects, like MBA is supposedly private sector. MPA to me is supposedly public sector. That's why I'm bookending what I'm doing to have both. I feel that it's encompassing enough to touch each major parts of each area of each subject to a certain depth that is usable when having a job like that or talking about those subjects.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's a uniqueness to what you are studying. And so when you view the MPA as different than the MBA, you're saying there's a uniqueness to the public sector and what we are studying and how we're studying in the public sector compared to what we would study and how we study it in the private sector. So I think uniqueness of what you are studying is a major element of an academic discipline. But again, there was a program when I was working in NASPA on their accreditation commission. There's a program, I won't mention the program, but there's a program that they combined their MBA and their MPA together, so much so that they would rotate their final culminating project. And so one year, the culminating project would be an MBA project. The next year, it would be an MPA project. Then the following year, it'd be an MBA project. And they actually had interwoven the two so closely together, it was essentially like one academic program. That's unusual. Usually we do have that separation because there is a uniqueness. And as we've covered so far tonight, we see that there are some unique elements of the public sector that are certainly different and distinct from what we see in the private sector. So I would agree. I think uniqueness of what we are studying certainly makes for an academic discipline. Not only the uniqueness of what we are studying, but I also think the uniqueness of how we study it also contributes to something being an academic discipline. So if you look at the types of methodologies that are used in history, they're going to look different than the methodologies that are used in psychology or the methods used in sociology. So when you have different unique methods of studying different unique phenomena, then I think you have the beginnings of a unique academic discipline. So I think that uniqueness is something that really helps to explain whether or not something's an academic discipline. And I think the next question that begs is, well, does the study of public administration demonstrate those elements? I mean, does it demonstrate the uniqueness necessary to be a separate academic discipline? I think tonight we've really laid a strong foundation for the answer to be yes when you're comparing public administration to business administration. However, the question that kind of lingers with us is it unique enough to distinguish public administration from political science and to make those two unique disciplines? There's no right or wrong answer to that question. Some people will say yes, and that's the approach we've used here at Long Beach. Other, like my graduate program, they would have said no, because the methods used in public administration are very, very similar to the methods that are used in political science. We collect our data in a very similar way. We analyze the data using similar types of analytical techniques. We draw similar types of conclusions. We have similar types of purposes. The organizations that we are studying in public administration are embodied within governmental organizations, and it's those governmental organizations that are being studied by political science. And so I think there are some who would argue, no, it's not a separate discipline, it's part of political science. Others would argue it is. I'm not here to give you the answer tonight. I want you to develop the answer on your own. And that's something that you're going to be doing on your midterm assessment, something you'll also do in a future Canvas essay. So I just kind of want to give you the basis that you can use in order to draw your own conclusion about whether or not public administration is its own academic discipline. But my favorite question is, so what? So what? Does it matter that it's a separate academic discipline? And I think it does matter. And it matters in terms of obviously the program you're enrolled in compared to another graduate program, but it does make a difference. So think about these issues, think about what you consider an academic discipline to be, and then draw a conclusion about if you believe public administration is its own academic discipline or not, and why you believe it is. And again, I think that's something you'll be doing in the midterm as well as a future Canvas essay. I'm not going to tell you what I think. I'm not going to, because I want you to come up with your own conclusion, because you are, after all, in an MPA program. And so I think in your first class, it's important for you to kind of have that understanding of public administration, whether or not it is a discipline. But another important aspect of an academic discipline is that academic disciplines come up with their own unique theories. And so if you're a unique academic discipline, you're going to come up with a whole body of theories to help you understand the phenomena within your field of study. And those different theories we see in public administration. And so where I'm going to leave it tonight, because this is a big topic we don't have time to cover in the remaining of class tonight, is next week we'll devote our attention to talking about the theoretical perspectives that have been developed in the field of public administration. And what I will do is I'll take you through the evolution and development of theoretical perspectives on public administration. We'll go through different schools of thought, starting with the late 1800s and moving into modern times. And we will compare those different schools of thought and show you how the whole field or discipline, however you view it, has evolved and developed over the past 150 years to really give you a good theoretical basis for then moving on into future courses in the program. But I think we'll stop there. We'll pick up on these theoretical perspectives next week, because I kind of hate to start it and then stop it and start it again. And we'll do all this then for next week. Okay, between now and then, think about this issue of public administration as a discipline and come up with a perspective on whether or not you think public administration is a discipline. Also, if you are in the MPA program, make sure to turn in your advancement candidacy form. If you are not in the program, just add a little comment in the submission area and let me know that you're not in the program, and I can go ahead and award you those 5 points. So that's about all I have for you tonight. Are there any questions or comments or observations while you have me here? We all good?
Yeah, one quick question regarding is the MPA a viable on standalone program? Is that due, or is that just for us to think about that right now?
Right now, that's for you to think about, but you also have on your, let me stop this share, I'll go back. You also have on your midterm, let me pull it up again. You have that, I believe, as one of your questions on your midterm. Let me scoot down here. Down here on scenario 4, 4A, discuss the field of public administration as a discipline. So think about it, and then you'll be giving me an answer to that then on that scenario for the midterm assessment. Okay. All right. If there's nothing else, thank you very much for being here tonight. Any questions, feel free to reach out and ask. Otherwise, I'll have this recording up on our Canvas site no later than tomorrow morning. So take care. Hope everyone has a good remainder of your week.
Sorry, I have one more question.
Oh yeah, go ahead. I'm still here.
I just wanted to know if you had posted it on Canvas yet.
The midterm?
Yeah.
It should be. In fact, let me just go and check since we are here. Let me go and double check it. if my internet allows me to. All right, I'm getting there. Let's see. It's on there. I just don't know if I've published it. So let me make sure I've published it. It's as easy as clicking a button for me to publish it. So let's see. You know, I did not publish it. That's a good point. It is now published. So thanks for bringing that to my attention. It's now published. You should be able to see it and start working on it whenever you like. So thanks a lot for pointing that out to me. But it's
Perfect,
ready
thank you.
there for you. Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Okay. Anything else? Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you very much. And I will talk to you again next week for week number 5. So take care and have a good week.